critical race theory. Who knew that was the threat to our republic?
Critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets.
A political fight heats up in the U.S. as Republican-led states ban critical race theory in American schools. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. It is the latest political flashpoint in America's growing culture war. Conservative activists are in a panic over critical race theory, a decades-old academic framework that explores the history of racial discrimination in America and analyzes the ongoing impact of systemic racism on the country's laws and institutions. Although critical race theory is taught at some universities and law schools, leading Republican lawmakers and politicians say it is a, quote, divisive tool used to indoctrinate American school children to make them hate their country.
Critical race theory teaches children as young as kindergarten to be ashamed of their skin color.
The American Federation of Teachers, which says that critical race theory is not being taught to children from kindergarten through high school, has dedicated $2.5 million to a legal fund to defend teachers who are, quote, disciplined or fired for teaching about the nation's history in a manner that allegedly falls foul of overbroad legislation that has been passed by GOP-controlled state houses, end quote. 6 states, Idaho, Iowa, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas, have now passed legislation restricting what can be taught in schools. While only Idaho mentions critical race theory by name, the bill's broad language restricts teachers' ability to teach about racism and other, quote, divisive concepts. 20 other states are considering similar legislation. Texas, Florida, and several other states have also banned the teaching of the so-called 1619 Project, launched in 2019 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the beginning of slavery in the U.S. Now, many of these new bills mirror the language used in an executive order signed by President Trump last September and which was rescinded by President Biden in January. It restricts the use of curriculums that examine systemic racism, white privilege, and other race bias issues. Speaking at the Conservative Political Action Conference on Sunday, Trump amplified his message to the base.
If government-run schools are going to teach children to hate their country, we will demand school choice, and we already have been. We believe in patriotic education for our children, and we strongly oppose the radical indoctrination of America's youth.
This messaging has filtered into school board meetings across the U.S., with hundreds of parents flooding auditoriums, charging teachers with discrimination, and in one case, leading to a parent's arrest.
You're teaching children to hate others because of their skin color.
Critical race theory and social justice are nothing but communist theories that largely use race to divide and destroy.
This is a racist, vile, and evil ideology that has infected this once great school district.
So why these impassioned reactions to critical race theory? And what are the long-term impacts on free speech and debates over racism in America's classrooms? I'm now joined by Mary Frances Berry, Professor of American Social Thought and Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the former chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Professor Berry, as you know, there are a lot of misconceptions and misrepresentations about what critical race theory actually is. Many Republican lawmakers are calling it divisive. For you, as a historian, as a scholar, as a prominent civil rights activist, what does critical race theory actually mean?
Well, critical race theory is a label that academics in law school put on a discussion of why you shouldn't worry about so much whether someone is personally a racist or not a racist, or an individual racist when something happens or is done to you, whether on your job or someplace else, or police or whatever. But you should look at the whole structure of society and the law itself and its evolution and say, wait a minute, the system is what has caused this, not some particular individual. Let's work on the system. So critical race theory is about let us solve racism and white supremacy by working on the legal system and the social and cultural systems, not worrying about targeting some particular individual.
But if that's what it is, why then are we seeing this sudden, relentless assault from conservatives on an academic legal framework, as you say, that's been around for decades and that looks at essentially race and its impact on the US legal and social structure?
Well, the public discussion about it is mainly a political discussion. It is a PR and political discussion. Since most people don't know what critical race theory is, they couldn't define it if you gave them $1 million. That in fact, when they hear those terms, they say, oh my God, what is that? And then they're told that it means that we're saying all white people are racist and that the whole country is racist, and we want our children taught that in school. And that isn't what people are saying at all. What they're saying is, let us teach about the honest history of the country and how we came to this past where we are in this day and age with all of the racial problems. And let us then look at the system that undergirds this and figure out how to end it.
And yet, as you say, many people on the right say that CRT, as it is known, assigns blame to white people, that it actually is racist against whites, that white children are being made to feel guilty and are being taught that white people are oppressors. The Republican leader in the House wrote this a few days ago. He said, critical race theory is the governing ideology of the entire Biden administration. By advocating for it, Democrats continue to fuel hatred and division across the country. America must reject critical race theory for a simple reason. State-sponsored racism is wrong, always. If this is yet another battle in the culture wars, what is the end goal? What can academics like you and the institutions you represent do to counter this false narrative?
All academics can do and all the public can do is to be informed and to see to it that children, whether they're white, black, brown, whoever they are taught the actual honest history of the country if we're ever going to confront our racial problems. We saw that with the George Floyd murder and the cases and all the things that have happened in this country, and then try to end these problems by looking at the system and see if there's some way we can adjust it or change it to make this stop happening. It is not about some individual child or a group of children or white people doing something personally with names. Maybe if we called it banana or something like that instead of CRT, maybe people would be less interested. But the minority leader's statement is simply a political statement, and I understand politics. Politics is about conflict and arguing one side or the other.
Professor Mary Frances Berry, great to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
On the issue of critical race theory, et cetera, I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand. And I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it.
As Republican lawmakers in Congress challenged the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's highest-ranking officer in the U.S. Armed Forces last month, about his views on critical race theory, a growing number of Republican state legislators pushed through bills to limit academic discussions about institutional racism. A Texas House bill, which goes into effect in September, prohibits teaching that, quote, slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States. Most of the anti-critical race theory bills use similar language. Oklahoma's legislation, which took effect on July 1st, bans teaching that could lead any individual to, quote, feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. The author of the Oklahoma House bill, Republican State Representative Kevin West, joins me now. Representative West, critics of your bill say the language you used was deliberately vague and ambiguous, that its aim is to censor conversations about racism in American history, and any attempt to look at the long-lasting impact it's had on racial equity in America today. Why try to stop this critical conversation about race?
Well, I do appreciate that question. The language in the bill, what we did was we identified 8 specific concepts that we have seen nationwide being used, and that's what we addressed. In our bill, here in Oklahoma, we have what is called the Oklahoma Academic Standards, which is written by teachers, by the school board. And we specifically reference that so that teachers would know that as long as they teach according to the standards, then there won't be any problems. But we didn't want these specific concepts such as one race or sex is inherently better than another, or one is automatically an oppressed race.
Isn't it just the latest attempt by Republicans to find a new bogeyman to rile up the base and vilify an entire segment of the population to try to whitewash important parts of their history?
No, I don't think so. Like I said, here in Oklahoma, we have the Oklahoma Academic Standards, which specifically specifies how we're going to teach about race relations, the Tulsa Race Massacre, the Oklahoma Land Run, the Trail of Tears, all of those kind of things, slavery, all of that. What this is doing is we wanted to specifically identify the concept of that you're going into the piece or the program with the specific outcome of having somebody feel like they're personally responsible for something that happened in the past.
But
and
that's
like
not what CRT does, Representative West. It doesn't hold every white person responsible for what happened in the past. It's looking at systemic racism, at institutional racism in America. Isn't that a valid thing to do?
Why we did not, one of the reasons why we didn't specifically call out critical race theory. Like I said before.
But it is being weaponized, though, by many Republicans as a fear tactic to secure votes. Should it be up to you and other politicians to decide what is taught at schools? Should politicians dictate what goes on in classrooms and what students should learn at school?
I believe that it is our responsibility to help protect against many of these concepts, and that was the overriding spirit behind the bill. The Oklahoma State School Board met yesterday and passed rules that implement this bill, and that passed 5-4. So the majority of the state school board agreed with that as well.
But how do you protect against anything, and how are these rules fair when part of the bill prohibits the teaching of anything that can make, quote, any individual feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race? How do you teach about the Tulsa Massacre, which happened a century ago in your own state?
The bill says that you can't teach the concept that you should feel a certain way. So a lot of people are overlooking that should. It has nothing to do with, whenever I was in school with many of these things like slavery, the Oklahoma Land Run, the Tulsa Race Massacre, I felt a certain way. It's not saying that you can't feel a certain way. It's saying that you're not going to go into it with the preconceived notion that one person or one race or one sex is responsible.
Well, no. The bill says nothing should be taught that makes any student feel that certain way. Any individual should not feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish as a result of what they're being taught at school. So I ask you, is it okay for teachers to go ahead and teach one of the darkest chapters of America's racial history. The looting, the burning of an entire black neighborhood in Tulsa by mobs of white armed men who were supported and armed by city officials. It's going to make a lot of white people feel uncomfortable. Does it mean it shouldn't be taught?
No, that it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be taught. It simply says that you're not going to go into it with the preconceived notion that somebody should feel that way.
How do you achieve racial justice if past injustices have become unspeakable thanks to the bills that you and other Republicans are pushing through?
Nothing in this bill will prevent them from teaching real American history, that many of the founders owned slaves, that slavery was part of American history, that we fought a civil war over that issue, and that slaves were free. We also went through...
But if that is the case, Representative, why then push this bill through? Are you saying that it was done just for political purposes then?
No, because like I said, we do have cases here in Oklahoma where students are being put through a class where they're talking about different things like their white privilege and which one is the most privileged. So what we're seeing right here is basically, just putting it out there that if you're white, you're automatically an oppressor, and if you're black, you're automatically oppressed.
But again, this is a misrepresentation. And what is interesting, finally, is to note that your bill is almost word for word what was in President Trump's executive order last September. Should we be surprised?
Well, I mean, we have friends in other states. We share ideas. I've talked to probably 4 other states that are either looking at doing a bill similar to this, or that has presented something similar to this. So those were concepts that we've seen throughout the nation. Many of them we've seen being done here in Oklahoma, and so that was why we addressed those 8 concepts.
All right, Oklahoma State Representative Kevin West, great to have your perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
How widespread is it? Well, we can't really be sure until we finally get cameras in the classroom as we put them on the chests of police officers.
While some conservative voices in the US media call for teachers to be monitored using body cameras, last week the board of the National Education Association, one of the nation's largest teachers' unions, approved over $127,000 in spending to publicize what critical race theory is. A poll published earlier this month, meanwhile, found that 82% of college students overall say public schools should teach that patterns of racism are ingrained in law and other institutions, including 97% of Democrats, 74% of independents, and 46% of Republicans. Teachers and educators in the US are expressing concern about the ongoing campaign against critical race theory. Lynn Pascarella is president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. She joins me now. Professor Pascarella, you heard what Republican legislators have been saying about this. You yourself said recently, quote, "We haven't seen this level of intrusion since McCarthyism, the vicious campaign back in the 1950s against alleged communists inside the US government and in other institutions." That's a very, very strong statement. Just how serious, how widespread is this campaign against teachers and academics?
It's very widespread, and it's of great concern. I taught critical race theory for 2 decades when I was a professor at the University of Rhode Island. I know it's a specific focus on legal theory, and it's been used by certain politicians as a rhetorical tool to undermine attempts at pursuing the truth in academia, which is fundamental to our mission as colleges and universities.
As you say, you did teach critical race theory. Is there anything in it that actually justifies the legislation that we're seeing in so many states and the extreme rhetoric surrounding it?
There isn't anything in critical race theory itself that would justify the extreme vitriol that we're hearing. Critical race theory is an attempt to look at laws and the history of legislation from the lens of diverse perspectives. It calls into question what are proposed as seemingly neutral laws. It doesn't encourage people to hate America or to revile certain races. It is an analytical tool that helps students discern the truth to help tell a fuller story of America's history.
What is the fear then? What is motivating this debate? What is driving it?
Well, there's already a prevailing national rhetoric that colleges and universities are bastions of liberal progressivism that are tearing apart the fabric of American society, that when students come to college, liberal professors will try to indoctrinate them to adopt particular points of view. I have not found that to be the case. In fact, students report that they don't usually feel chilled. And so it's troubling to see this legislation in places like Florida that are monitoring the specific viewpoints of students and faculty in order to be able to determine whether or not there's a liberal bias.
And your association represents over 1,200 public and private academic institutions. How concerned are teachers and academics? How constitutional is it for state universities in those states where laws have been passed that ban CRT? How constitutional is it for these state universities to infringe on academic freedoms going forward?
Well, to the first question, faculty are very concerned about the infringement upon academic freedom. Academic freedom is important to the mission of colleges and universities, as I mentioned, and it does require the unfettered pursuit of the truth and the free exchange of ideas. And if you have legislation that proscribes discussing certain topics, then that undermines academic freedom and destabilizes the entire academy. Whether it's constitutional will remain to be seen, but it seems to me that the Constitution, well, at least courts in the past have ruled in favor of promoting academic freedom when it comes to experts within the academy who get to decide what constitutes the truth, as opposed to legislators who may not be concerned as much about the truth as furthering a particular political agenda.
But so what impact will this have on the quality of higher education, which is really the envy of much of the world, higher education here in the United States, when the teaching, the questioning of all aspects of American history, including the enslavement of African Americans, the massacre of Native Americans, and other dark chapters of US history, may become out of bounds?
Well, it has the potential to have a profound impact and to exacerbate an already growing racial and economic segregation in higher education. We saw what happened with Nicole Hannah-Jones in North Carolina, where she was not given tenure immediately and then begrudgingly given tenure, and she decided to go to Howard University, a historically Black college and university. And I think this is a sign of what will happen in states where institutions are prohibiting the teaching of critical race theory. It will be much more difficult for them to attract top faculty, staff, and students.
All right, Professor Lynn Pasquarella, certainly challenging times. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, thank you.
Now, first, there was the critical legal studies, an academic field here in the US, which argued that the law was not objective or apolitical, that it was not neutral or unbiased. From there emerged a subfield in the 1970s, the critical race theory, which added the racial dimension to that debate. And as is the case for any country, its laws are a product of its history. In the US, Trump and many of his Republican supporters would rather let sleeping dogs lie. But since that dog was suddenly reawakened by the killing of George Floyd, they're on a mission to put it back to sleep. The ongoing frenzy by Republicans to muzzle CRT by painting it as an unpatriotic indoctrination of Americans, presumably whites, to hate their own country from kindergarten onward, as former Vice President Pence claims, illustrates the extent to which some politicians are unwilling to reckon with the country's past, let alone its present. And in that, the United States is not alone. Few countries are willing to have an introspective look into the nefarious aspects of their own history, falsely believing that, as Winston Churchill famously said, history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. And so, in short, as Republicans and Democrats square off in an engineered political fight about what may or may not be taught in schools, the sudden emergence of critical race theory, which few had heard of until now, is deepening the growing societal rifts. No matter how hard some try to suppress parts of America's history, history itself will be unkind to them because they, just like Churchill, cannot write it. That's all for this week from me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the team. Join us again next time as we take another look inside America.